in here, but my furthest north, I think I've noticed, is Leeds so far as what I've spotted. I'll keep an eye out. Okay, so welcome. Those of you who know me, my name's, or don't know me rather, my name's Lucinda. I'm a chartered psychologist. My background is many years in corporate learning and development roles. So I have done a very similar role to many of you here. I worked for Pfizer and then I worked for Siemens, and picked up a lot of experience in those environments. Since then, my day job now is I am founder and CEO of Actus. And it's worth explaining that we have a performance, talent and learning management software platform. We also have standalone 360. It's quite comprehensive, and I spend lots of time working with colleagues and also customers in the OD aspects of that, because generally if you buy software, you buy it because you want to achieve something culturally, and that's my passion, is supporting people with the cultural aspects that they're trying to achieve. You may know me from the podcast that I host. I've been hosting for a couple of years. If you don't, it might be worth looking up, because we've got about 140 different podcast episodes, some really great specialist ones. I've had some great speakers on there, so there might be something that you find relevant if there's something you want to gen up on there. Okay, so that's me, and I can see you are introducing Rodney, saying British Antarctic survey. I thought you were going to say you're coming from the Antarctic, but you're in Cambridge. That is still quite cool. That's quite a cool role there, Rodney, so welcome here. So just briefly, in terms of explaining the platform that we have, our software offers performance, talent and learning management. So if you are ever in the market for that, do consider looking at what we do here. And also we have got e-learning and training courses as well. So if you're looking for development in any way, I've just started our virtual change superhero training, which is great fun. Our November course is fully booked, but we will have more courses available on the website in 2022. So you know, if you're looking for those sort of things, do bear us in mind, or in terms indeed in consultancy. So focusing on why you're here. So we're focusing really on this term of underperformance. And the reason I did this topic, again, is actually when I looked at the HR Uprising podcast episodes, it comes up time and again as a really important or interesting topic to people. And I would like to, ex-netball player, yeah, I get a bit stiff there. I won't go off on the netball one, but good to know I've got some netballs on here, Claire and Lorraine. So if we think about underperformance, I'm interested, why did this particular topic interest you? Is this a challenge for you in your organisation? I mean, my question would be, are you seeing more underperformance, different underperformance? I've got some research that I'm going to share with you that I picked up from Gary Cookson this week on that topic. Why is this a topic that seems to really interest, or is it challenge people? And if you're seeing underperformance, I'll ask you a little bit about that in a moment. I've got a poll on this to explore as to what we're actually seeing in terms of underperformance. So is this more of a pain point than you found it to be previously? So why don't I actually launch this at the same? I'm saying a little bit here in terms of the feedback you're saying. I'll let you put feedback in the chat and I'll launch my poll in a moment. So seeing the shift in performance issues, it is interesting. So I'm going to let you put the chat as to what you're seeing here, guys. Let's see whether we're in a similar position, because it's really useful actually to compare notes. Sometimes it's good to see how other people feel these things. So yes, this is interesting. So if you were to define underperformance, I'm going to put the traditional underperformance. So we might have talked about underperformance previously as being something that would precede maybe a capability or conduct issue. Clearly, we want to avoid that. And capability would have been where someone is unable to achieve standards of performance due to a lack of skill, health, ability or training. And conduct would have been to do with people's behaviour. So you'd think there that people are choosing to underperform. Now, it's really interesting, because my question is really, has the pandemic created different capability issues, for example? Have people been unable to perform because of circumstances outside of their control, like, I guess, home environment or work environment or access to information? But actually, as Helen's saying there, is it fair? Is it something fair? Is it something we should have to pick up on? Tatiana, you've raised something there about IT skills. That's an interesting one. That came out of the conversation I was talking to Gary. I've got a podcast coming up soon about the conversation I had with Gary Cookson. He suggested that some underperformance is coming down to people misusing technology, and that could be a development or a training issue. So it's not necessarily people are intending to underperform. So again, it's a development issue possibly. are people lacking in motivation because they're burnt out? We don't know what these causes are, and that is where it all critically comes down to. So it's almost like the old school. One of the hardest things, I think, if you are, and see many of us are learning and development, about being in HR at the moment, is that what the pandemic has done is it's introduced shades of grey in relation to underperformance. Quite often we would have said previously it's fairly black and white. People can or can't do it. You give people training, you know, you would set out performance expectations, but all of a sudden things vary from circumstance to circumstance, and we can't necessarily treat everybody the same. And actually policies don't necessarily allow for that, do they? Which makes it extremely difficult to work out, when do you deal with something in the way of it being an underperformance issue, or when do you consider it to be something that has to be a supportive and a well-being issue? So it's really quite tricky. So thank you for the comments that you put in here. I was mentioning I was going to put a poll up. Let's put a poll up so everybody can contribute, because we've got 80 odd people on this call. So it's easier if I put a poll up and you can actually, we can see what we think the causes are and what our overall experience is. So this question is saying, do you, in your experience in your organisation, consider that performance issues have increased, decreased, or remained the same over the last 15 months? And do you think the reasons, whichever of your answer you've chosen, do you think the reasons have been the same as they used to be, you know, in terms of, you know, the usual conduct issues? Would it have been similar sort of things, or are they different issues? Can I just check? Gemma's just mentioned to me, is there a strange squiggly line on the screen? Oh, there is a squiggly line on the screen. That's me. Thank you, Gemma. That's something on the I've obviously written on it. So that would be a few more moments. We've got 69% participation while I work out how to get rid of my squiggly line. Okay, I'm going to count down. So we've got 77% participation. Anyone else want to contribute? 77%. Final answers. I'm going to end the poll. 3, 2, 1. I'll close the poll now. So sharing the results. So interesting. So the opinions of people on this call are that actually performance issues have increased. More people think they've increased, but the reasons for those have changed. How interesting. Interesting, the ones that think the numbers have remained the same and the reasons have remained the same seem to be almost exactly the same number. I wonder if it's the same people. So what do we think as to why that might be? So what are your reasons, guys? And if you think the reasons have changed, if we rule out things that have gone now, like childcare, for example, where people are not homeschooling, so why do you think things have changed? And what would be an example of a different cause of underperformance in your experience now compared to how things were pre-pandemic, so 15 odd months ago? So Rebecca's saying it could be to do with different skills that you need to do with remote working. Yes, I've got a theory on that, and which I'm going to talk to you right at the end. What skills are you thinking there, Rebecca, though? Is it like technical skills, or is it time management? What sort of things do you think? So then we've got draining, isolation, people are unable to focus. Yeah. People won't, actually, this is very interesting. So a lot of it's coming down to the individual, isn't it? Is what people are saying here. And that might be the key thing. So, and the thing is it about blurring the lines, or are people just putting too much pressure on themselves? Communication and clear objectives, lots and lots of things. So some of it is about management behaviours, but some of it is almost about the individual, that people were not ready, or maybe have almost overdone it. So people are almost pushing, they're not necessarily ready to be empowered to such an extent, so much freedom, etc. And then there are other things like isolation, If people are inclined to, so I guess if people are inclined to underperform, then they might have less visibility. If your line manager is not managing, then that can create it. But I suspect actually that kind of behavior is probably there all along. So it's interesting that whether people now, because they're remote so much, are changing it. It is interesting. There's lots of really interesting chat there. So some of what you're saying relates to the conversation I had with Gary Cookson. His view was, this is my clumsy diagram of it, is that he actually thought that some of it might just be visibility. And we had this conversation. He was saying that certain types of underperformance when you're in the office, whether it would be, how someone's spoken to a customer, you're overhearing people on a conversation, you're not hearing that anymore. So those bits of underperformance might be now going unnoticed. So in this environment, people may not be performing, but we don't see it. But then when we're working remotely, there might be different types of underperformance or undesirable performance that we do or don't see. So the really scary thing about that conversation was like saying, actually, do we never ever see the real levels of underperformance? I don't know. What do you think of that? Do you think it's about visibility or otherwise? I mean, I personally want to, I suppose, push back on that as a concept. It might well be right, but I suspect that the actual levels of underperformance are way, way lower, maybe than we're concerned. And in flipping it the other way, in terms of the number of people who are absolutely smashing it out of the park, I wouldn't want this to be disproportionate. It's not suggesting that everybody's doing it. It's just that where the underperformance is happening, maybe there is more underperformance than we realise, or maybe more abusing the system, or perhaps not performing in the way that you choose if you were supervising people day in, day out. But it's different. So this is some of the things, out of sight, out of mind. So there's some level of agreement there. So I think that's an interesting point. Just is it visibility? Is it that we're not seeing things anyway? And we've talked a little bit in the chat now about what's causing this underperformance and why you're saying it's exacerbated by the hybrid environment. You're right that people's work days have changed. They've got less time bound. Managers, I've done lots on management. Line managers, particularly in the UK, are not necessarily great at setting clear goals and expectations and giving regular feedback, which are core fundamental skills for driving high performance. And the reality is, they weren't great at it. As a nation, we haven't really invested in management development all that well. We weren't great at it prior to the pandemic. You put that into a virtual environment, then potentially that is exacerbated further. So we're even worse at it. It becomes a bigger problem. It is interesting. Some people feel that you need them to be observed to work effectively. Some don't, but it's not necessarily consistent. It could be the same people, different people, but in the same role within the same team. So one person might be absolutely so productive because within that home environment, being left to get on their own devices, where the others need to be around people. There might be an introversion extroversion piece. Is it a time management piece? Is there a whole sort of empowerment where the people have the skills to manage things? I think there is something there in that, and I'm going to look into that more in next year. I just recently reviewed a book called Smart Working. I was looking around to see if it's around me, which talked about actually this challenge of people being ready to be empowered. We hadn't necessarily, if you're in an environment where you're used to being fed, you're used to someone fishing for you, you're used to somebody telling you what to do, and then suddenly you're left to your own devices and you've got to feed yourself. Not everybody is going to know how to do it. And not everybody has the skills. Let's say they don't necessarily know how to fish. They haven't been shown how to use the fishing line, to labour that analogy. So it may well be that we have never really provided people with those right skills. And because we had to go to home working en masse so quickly, we didn't really get the chance to provide those skills to people. So not only did the managers not have those, as Tatiana's saying, have the self-management planning skills, the line managers didn't have the right skills to provide that steering guidance. Type of work makes a difference, 100%, Sonia, I agree with that. Yeah, absolutely. So there's lots there that we're saying in terms of it can be exacerbated by a hybrid environment, yet equally, we do know that organisations have carried on performing. Many people don't want to go back into the work environment, and I do not believe that's because they want to stay at home and be lazy. Many people are choosing not to do that because they're actually, sorry, my cat's come to visit, they're choosing to do that because they feel that they're more productive, because lots of people, it's about self-empowerment, it's about their self-actualization. They get great satisfaction from their job, and they actually feel they can do more remotely. So it's definitely not that everyone is wanting to work from home because they want to shirk. Many people feel they're more productive, and maybe it's also that we're getting this payback of not having to sit and commute, whether it's a safety thing, all that time. So if you haven't got a 3-hour commute and you're therefore able to use that time, let's say of that 3 hours, an hour goes to work, an hour goes to exercise, an hour goes to family, then everyone feels they've got better work-life balance. So there's nothing wrong with that, I guess. I'm interested here. So Rebecca's saying there's a lack of curiosity and proactivity. You learnt more through YouTube videos than internal training. Is that about actually how to manage yourself? But yeah, it's a bit hit and miss, isn't it, about how you find them? Sorry. Yes, so Sue Turner's asked a question. Feel free to comment on Sue's question in the chat about whether you found it people in junior roles. Because certainly, Sue, I've worked with a number of businesses over the last 18 months, and a lot of them have done brilliantly during the pandemic. But actually, the whole the hardest thing is bringing up to speed new starters. It's fine if you know what you're doing, but it's much harder if you are if you're someone that's got to learn. And they found that they needed to maybe have someone who knows what they're doing to sit alongside them to be able to help people to perform, and you needed to actually have some physical time. Or what they found is that things like, this was a financial services business with actuaries, they were finding that they took longer to train up. That was their experience. So looking at some of the research I did about why is it such a challenging problem also at the moment, other reasons why it's hard. Well, no one really likes managing underperformance. That's the reason this is always popular. I'm sorry, I'm just going to put my cat out. I apologise. No one likes holding people accountable. It's a really tough thing to do. And none of us really like giving negative feedback, and so it's avoided. So that's Harvard Business Review says that actually many people find that one of the toughest bits of their job. We also know that managing underperformance is really time consuming. It's really, again, it's painful and it's time consuming. Who's going to want to prioritize it? So ignoring things, sweeping things under the carpet can be easier to do. Now, of course, to my mind, that is false economy, because if our line managers were realizing that all they need to do is set clear objectives and have regular feedback, then they're going to prevent the underperformance in the first place, then that would be less of an issue. We know that the pandemic, there's been so much change, there's been changing priorities. So confusion, that's a legitimate reason as to why people might not have been performing to their normal standards. Many line managers or businesses even are not good at setting goals which are outputs rather than inputs. So if we want to solve this, and certainly if you're going to carry on having long-term home working, then outputs, we have to keep people accountable against their outputs, because then it really doesn't matter. You could argue it doesn't matter whether or not as long as you're delivering the outputs your job's there to do. If you're doing them in 1 day a week and they're the right outputs, or 5 days or 7 days a week, doesn't necessarily matter, as long as those outputs are what are needed. Clearly, you'd like to think that people have got outputs that are commensurate with the hours they're paid, but that's the key, is focusing on outputs rather than inputs. We do need managers to be courageous, honest, and create trust to actually make sure we can give feedback for people to learn and development. And we do know that there's so many legitimate stresses that have been going on and continue to go on. We've got a real issue in terms of keeping an eye on people's mental health, stress, well-being. We need tolerance there, because actually if people go off with something like stress, it tends to be a long-term issue. And that is something that we really do need to prevent that. In fact, I did a webinar last month on stress and pressure. So if you missed that, there's a recording of that there, which is all about managing the stress of the pressure curve for people, because very often individuals need to self-manage that. I think this is what we're finding, is that many people don't have these skills to look after themselves, to look after their well-being, to be self-managing about time, to learn, as Rebecca's saying, to be proactive about what they need to learn, about basically taking ownership for their own results and their own development. So I guess this model here, the KISS model of causes of underperformance, I wondered, we said earlier, didn't we, that in terms of the results, we said that the reasons for underperformance have changed. So that would suggest to me that this model that I've been using for donkey's years about causes of underperformance might not work anymore. And I did wonder whether that was the case. Having said that, from the conversations I've had so far, I think it probably still does work as a very general guideline. And the reason having a model is useful is it helps you to diagnose how to treat the cause of underperformance. So very simply, and this was pre-COVID, and we'll see if we can break it here. So let's see if we can come up with reasons for underperformance that we couldn't possibly fit into one of these 4 causes. So the first one I've got is clarity. Now, historically, clarity was always the biggie. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. Whether it still is the biggie in these current circumstances, that's maybe the question mark for me. Second one is individual attitude. Someone's got an attitude issue or they're choosing not to perform. Third one is skill or knowledge. So maybe they haven't been trained or given the skill to perform. And the fourth one is surrounding environment. Maybe people around them are doing that, or maybe helping them or affecting their ability to perform. So if I look at each one in turn, and I'll say, have a think yourselves, let's see if we can break the model, see if we can come up with something that doesn't fit in there, or let's see if it still works or whether we need to update it. So generally speaking, clarity is about people having clear goals, objectives, and milestones. That's our point about outputs. Are your line managers giving people clarity? Do you have systems or a cadence where you expect objectives to be cascaded down the organisation, people to have visibility of them? Are you encouraging managers to do regular feedback, telling them they should be doing one-to-ones, which are meaningful, so that people continually have that clarity? And the big change there, I mean, clarity was still really, really important. For me, what people really had to do is they had to increase the quality of the feedback, the quality of the conversations, and the frequency. It was more little and often in the hybrid environment. So you needed to, even a monthly one-to-one might not have been enough, certainly at the start. It may be now, as people getting more self-sufficient, be more so. And certainly if you are training someone up at a junior role almost daily, or inducting someone, you had to talk very regularly. So it's quite time consuming. People management is time consuming if it's done well. Now, of course, the clarity piece here that came through with the pandemic is that maybe the line manager wasn't so good at communicating. Maybe the priorities shifted because they weren't geared up for a hybrid environment. What do you do in a remote environment? And also business priorities may have shifted. So, for a certain extent, we would have been moving on our old objectives, yet circumstances might have changed, which made objectives unachievable. For example, let's say you were selling into the catering sector and it had entirely closed down. There's lots of reasons where you would have found it more difficult to achieve a goal. But if those goals are changed, ideally, the conversation should take place so that it still have clarity about what's expected. So confusion, lack of clarity can be caused by lots of change. Of course, we experience lots of change. So that still probably was a current issue. And it always, certainly in the old world, was one of the most common ones, which is quite ironic because it's the one which is most usually easily changed if a manager is highly effective. The second one is this idea of individual attitude or skill. And when I think to my in-house roles, what you might find is a manager would come along and say, oh, so-and-so's got a performance issue, they're a problem. It's where the person's being labelled as being a problem. Now, the reality is no one really joins a job or an organisation wanting to underperform. So some of these comments we're talking about, there are a few people, but it's the minority, isn't it? And actually, if they have got into that stage where they're choosing not to perform, what's caused them to do that? The likelihood is they've had an issue with their line manager, whether there's a motivation issue, maybe they don't feel they're in the right job, they're not brought into the organisation, something else circumstantially might have changed. Maybe they're not very well, they've got family concerns or issues, they're suffering burnout. Those, all of a sudden, that became in where you actually might have a legitimate individual reason, where previously you might have said, well, if they've got an attitude problem, they should just go. I would argue that you should find out why that is and try and prevent it in the first place. But, now it's much more grey, is that people are not choosing that way. There's been circumstances, or perhaps they don't quite have the ability to manage their time on their own. Now, if it's ability to manage their time, I'd say that's not attitude. that fits here into skill. So maybe they just don't know how to prioritize. They don't know how to ask for help. Maybe they haven't been given training, or the training they were given, because it's a really highly practical, job. Yeah, they need to be in a lab and they're having to do things virtually. Maybe it wasn't suitable. Therefore, they haven't had the practice that they would have done. So they're taking longer to get up to speed. So those could be quite interwoven. So skills may not have been taken on as quickly. As we were saying, certainly if it's something where you need to learn from others, from social learning, it may be more difficult. And then the surrounding environment. I used to think this was really quite a less common one. So in the old workplace, it might have been because, let's say I'm arriving late or I'm working a certain work pattern. That's because I've looked around people around me and I think that's acceptable because others are doing it. I'm just copying what others do. But the reality is the surrounding environment probably has had quite an impact on people in this environment. It may be that they haven't got a good desk set up. Still, let's hope they fixed it by now if they haven't. Or they've got, they're in a multi-house, so they're getting stressed, they're not getting away from their work. Absolutely, Sue. Who they're surrounded by, they're not getting away to work. When that becomes a different mental health, so the surrounding, these all feed to each other, don't they? So if you have something like that where you've got people you're surrounded by, it's not conducive to working, then actually that increases your chances of having an individual reason why you're not performing. So the real causes, they kind of feed each other potentially, and undoubtedly that surrounding environment might have caused it. So let me ask you, before I say, we'll come back to how we'll come to some solutions or some suggested solutions. In your opinion, here, let's just put another poll up. Which of these causes of underperformance now, and I'd say that previously it probably was clarity in the old world. I used to probably get about 50-60% of people said the main cause was clarity. Is it still that, or do you think it's changed? And I am being mean because I'm saying just go for one. So which do you think the most common cause is now? Okay, we're nearly up to 70% participation. So that's it. I'll just count down. 3, 2, 1. I'll stop and share. That's fascinating. So if I compare this with you with a poll we would have done 18 months ago, it would have been mainly clarity. And look, it's really, really even now, isn't it? How interesting. So can anyone, I did say that, feel free to break the model. Can anyone come up with an example of a cause of underperformance that doesn't fit into that model? Because we've said earlier that we think the causes have changed. Now, what we're seeing here is they still fit into the model potentially. It's just that there's different emphasis. It's less about clarity, less about the management style and giving clarity, but it's more about other areas. So I don't know what your first name is. I've got TX Guthrie here. People want to go into the office, but they're distracted when they're office by noise. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we've got used to peace and quiet. So suddenly it would be really, we're suddenly realizing that having that noise around us is difficult. But I guess I'd say that's environment, right? That's environment. Same with that one. Safety, Kelly, that would probably be environment. I think this anxiety, stress and general well-being, for me, that I think is a subtle difference that has changed. So I don't think it's about attitude anymore, but it is about individual circumstances or individual well-being, maybe. So it's about the person, isn't it? But it's not saying they've got an attitude or they're choosing not to. There's more of an issue. Hitting a wall due to work-life balance, actually. So again, that's down to the individual well-being. I wonder what the term would be. Uncertainty and stress, Tatiana, definitely. So uncertainty is a lack of clarity, isn't it? So it's a change. And stress could be an external factor. Yeah, expectations. So I mean, I'm seeing that there's quite a lot of similar, they still fit into this area, which is helpful because we can think about how we can help people in those. If it's clarity, what do? We provide clarity. If it's about individual, and I say this is what's maybe shifting, it's not shifting, it's not a attitude issue. If it's about the individual, then what we do is we maybe need to work with the individual and provide personalized support or understand those gaps. Skills and knowledge, we can train people. Surrounding environment, interestingly, I don't know what we do about that now in some of these areas, because if it's the home environment, we used to be able to control it when we're there, but what can we do to fix or support with the surrounding environment? We can provide equipment and processes, and we can provide an office, but the environment is harder now for us as an organisation to support people with their work environment, isn't it? Okay, well, let's focus on what we can do. Practical things that we can do in terms of helping people is make sure we have got that culture of output-driven priorities and regular review. If possible, systemize it. So, you know, if you know that everything was being done on paper, or managers were a bit sloppy about one-to-ones, a bit lazy, you had no regular routine or processes, now's the time to really put those expectations on the line managers, potentially use systems to help them with that, and make sure that people have total clarity, because if they're remote, it's really easy for them not to know what the clarity is. So this is where systems can be really helpful. Make sure that managers know how to give quality feedback and they put the time in to do it. Look at behavioural expectations. So where you might have had a competency framework, well, make sure that also reflects behaviours online, virtual behaviours. You know, should people have cameras on? Should people be visible on your chat platforms? What are the expectations? Bring them into the 21st century, post-COVID century, where we're using much more technology, and make sure you have expectations there. Empower the individual, and I think that is a key one that deserves more focus, and I'll talk a little bit more just on my last slide on that one, because it's growing in importance in my head. Reassure people, support them in terms of meeting agreed timelines, make sure they're appropriate, and where you've got people starting out, give them local support and buddies. So where people are all remote, give them human contact and buddies to help them to perform and to ask questions, particularly with things like new starters. If you've got a new starter, give them somebody that they can speak to that is able to help them and is the go-to. If you're a line manager, the individual doesn't always want to come to you for everything. They don't want to admit they don't know things. So giving a local support and buddy can be really helpful. How many of you have set in place, I saw someone on here said they were writing a policy as we speak. How many of you set in place behavioural expectations and policies now about hybrid or remote working? Because it's worth doing. And this is a different way of looking at clarity. So if you think that people are, you know, are not behaving appropriately because culturally, let's say, the culture has become such that, as I say, no one turns their camera on anymore. So you're actually people are not listening in meetings, they're not interacting, they're not truly present. So maybe what you need to do is start setting some behavioural expectations around virtual meetings if they haven't had them. So you put them in place, that they've been communicating, you're forgetting. So again, we need to keep them live. People do forget things, keep reinforcing them. You need to re-establish the culture that you want going forwards. People in pajamas, people seriously turn up in pajamas. I can understand that, Kelly. That's I'd at least have my pajamas on my bottom half. Setting expectations around hybrid meetings, get people to communicate their status through effective calendar management. Really don't be scared, and it doesn't have to come top down, for engaging work groups. Some of the teams I've worked with have done a great job on this, where they've actually engaged people. What does good look like? What are our expectations? And put out some sort of, even if it's interim, a charter, a behavioural charter around hybrid working. What do we expect of people? Of course, we want to nip poor behaviours in the bud. So let's say we had used this example about saying we expect people to have their cameras on, and everyone's been provided with technology to be able to do this. We could give them feedback about this. So get managers to get the habit where they can do this. So here's our SBI. Some of you will be familiar with this situation behaviour impact model. So at the recent company video, I noticed that only 50% of people had their camera on. This made the session less interactive and made those who were getting involved feel self-conscious. As a business going forwards, our policy is cameras on for company briefings unless there's exceptional circumstances. So that's a very specific piece of feedback that might be given by one person or otherwise, or it just could be a set of principles, but it's how do we reinforce them? Because you set expectations, people do forget them unless they are reinforced. And it's interesting, so a few of you put things like people in pajamas or eating, and the problem is what happens is that if we don't say what's acceptable behaviour, then norms establish themselves. And before you know it, you've got a culture where eating in your pajamas with your camera on or off, munching over the microphone, is acceptable because or at least it's common. And if you allow it to continue, then it does become the culture, the way we do things around here. And actually, is that the right thing? So you need to nip it in the bud, but you can't just say that's the wrong thing to do and pick on one person because someone else might be doing it. So you have to collaborate and go, what's acceptable, what isn't? Get that definition, that charter, that the behavioural setup in place, get it circulated, get it sponsored, and then it's kind of, hang on, you're breaking that, someone's eating, turn your camera off or whatever it is. It's some might say this is basic manners, but not everybody has, what's common sense to one person is not to the next. So find a way of nipping them in the bud. And then the final area that I'm not going to go into here, but I think I'm going to do more on next year because it's coming through as a theme time and again for me at the moment. And I think it came through really strongly in the chat here as well. Not everybody has the experience, skills, confidence, knowledge to be self-managing. And what we've had to do is everyone was thrust into it, but not everyone either likes it, some people thrive on it, or necessarily have the skills of it. And so I think we might need to consider more education or developing people. So we've been doing lots on well-being, but it's almost like the people who need the well-being aren't necessarily waking up to the fact that they need it. It's like that classic thing is the people who come on the training and not the ones that need the training. And I think there's something there about getting people to work out boundaries. So what are their boundaries to get? So could you do a session with individuals, okay, what are your work boundaries? So in terms of, do you sit at your desk? What's your routine? When do you leave your desk? Because some people will be saying, oh, I can't leave my desk between 8 and 8 or whatever it is. They don't go and walk the dog. They don't eat properly. There's something where they have got misconstrued boundaries in their heads, which means they're not going to be effective. They're not going to be good at managing time, and they're going to be real recipe for burnout. And I think there's more risk around that personally at the moment than there is about people swing the lead. So I think there's something there where we need to teach people those individual skills to be self-managing for them actually. So not everyone can be empowered, if you see what I mean, unless they've actually been taught and they understand how to do it and they've got the skills and resilience to do it. Don't know, what's your view on that? I've got a sense that that is something that we need to do more of. Yeah, holding back at and also like reining in those sort of things, Laura, where people are doing too much chat or otherwise. There's lots of things and habits and behaviours that people need to have those feedback on. So we covered quite a bit there. I jumped around Underperformance there. I've expanded. It's been a topic that we've done before. I hopefully brought it up to date in terms of what that means for us. Really interested as to anything you're going to take away or something you're already doing that you're prepared to share. If you don't mind putting it in the chat, it's always really, really helpful for us. If you could put it in the chat. Yes, so not, yes, okay, so that's great. So Sultan's saying she agrees, not everyone has the skills to self-manage, but when you step in, you feel they can't without upsetting them. That's the key, isn't it? I think that's the key, is we've got to make it acceptable. I think it's the new time management or personal effectiveness. So it's really, it's personal effectiveness in a hybrid environment. Is really probably what we're talking about. That's what the course will be. I will be thinking about it over Christmas. That's what I used to train on, something called the 7 habits, and I think it's to do with people being proactive, making choices. It's about balancing. It is about management skills. It's about people renewing and making sure that they balance their home life and their work life. And it absolutely is about establishing boundaries and working within boundaries. So yeah, let me know if you think that's the personal effectiveness. Maybe that's not the title, but maybe that's what people need. We need to give people support in that area. So let me know what thoughts you've got, what you might do, what you're going to do to address any issues in your organisation. Just between now and Christmas, our next 2 webinars are, we're talking about performance management in a hybrid world, so how to redesign it. That's more about the performance management process. And then moving on to that topic of talent management, because we have got this concern about the Great Resignation. Is that a real thing? Well, interesting, let's see. Also, if you'd like to join us, we have our Change Superhero Coffee Club. I've forgotten the date. It's not on here. I think it's the 17th. I might be making that up. That is just register here, sign up. It's a networking, informal networking to do. So you will go along. We're going to talk about hybrid working, but we may well talk about what's causing underperformance, get into the granularity of that. And the Great Resignation is something we're going to talk about soon. We're running those probably every 6 weeks or so, totally informal, just an opportunity to network, share ideas with peers. And more on our training there, should you wish to know it. Useful resources, I'll pop those up. Caitlin will send this out to you, so don't worry, look out as ever for those aspects. And I'll have a quick look with the chat, and let me also just pop up, if any of you want more information, because I know there are some new people on here, some of you aren't, so don't worry, but if you want to know any more information about what we do, then you can you can just say it here in the chat, so we'll just follow up actively rather than you having to wait for those. So we've got the thank you, Gemma. What's the date, Gemma? Is it 17th? Yes, Lauren, so you will get the slides. Yes. So yeah, thank you. So it's 17th, so we'll send the slides out to you, and all the links are on the slides, so it's really easy for you to access there as well.